I believed I had the perfect family until the day a stranger at the bank thanked me for trusting them with an account I never knew existed, and in that quiet moment something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I remember the exact way the fluorescent lights hummed above me as I sat across from the young woman behind the desk, her polite smile never wavering as she turned her screen slightly in my direction. "Mrs. Collins," she said, "you've been very consistent with your contributions over the past 5 years. It's impressive, especially given your fixed income one." Didn't answer right away because none of it made sense. Fixed income contributions. I had spent the last 2 years clipping coupons, comparing generic brands at the grocery store, and stretching every dollar of my Social Security check. I had postponed replacing my worn-out winter coat and cut my prescription pills in half more than once just to make them last until the end of the month. So when she said consistent contributions, I felt like she was talking about someone else, someone who had a life that looked nothing like mine. I leaned forward just slightly, my hands resting on the edge of the desk, and asked her to repeat what she had just said. She did without hesitation, as if there was nothing unusual about it, as if it was completely normal for a woman my age to forget an entire financial account under her own name. She clicked through a few more screens, and that was when I saw it, my name, Margaret Collins, typed neatly at the top of the account statement, followed by a balance that made my chest tighten, not because it was small but because it was far larger than anything I had ever had access to in my life. Numbers that didn't belong to someone who counted every gallon of gas and every prescription refill. Numbers that suggested stability, even comfort, and yet I had been living as if I had none of those things for years. I remember asking her quietly, "Are you sure this is mine?" And she nodded with a kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. She even pointed out my Social Security number, confirming every detail with a calm professionalism that only made the situation feel more surreal. I should have felt relieved. I suppose most people would have felt grateful, maybe even excited to discover money they didn't know they had, but instead, I felt something colder, something heavier, a slow creeping realization that this wasn't a gift or a mistake. It was something else entirely, something hidden from me, something managed without my knowledge. And as I sat there staring at the screen, I began to think about all the small moments I had dismissed over the years, the times my daughter-in-law Lily had insisted on helping me organize my paperwork, the way she would gently take documents out of my hands saying it was too complicated for me, or how my son Ethan always reassured me that everything was taken care of, that I didn't need to worry about finances anymore because they had it under control. I had trusted them because that's what you do when you believe you have a good family, when you believe the smiles around your dinner table are genuine and the concern in their voices comes from love, not something else entirely. I thought about the holidays, the photographs, the way Lily would post pictures online calling us a perfect family, her arm always wrapped around Ethan's while I stood just slightly off to the side smiling the way I thought I was supposed to smile. And for the first time I wondered how much of that image had been real and how much had been carefully arranged. I realized then that perfection can be a performance, something polished and presented for others while the truth stays hidden in quiet places like a bank account no one talks about. I looked back at the young woman across from me and asked a simple question: who has access to this account? She hesitated just for a second before answering, and that hesitation was enough to confirm what I was already beginning to understand, that whatever this was, it had been happening for a long time and I had been the last person to know about it. And as I sat there in that small office with the hum of the lights overhead and the faint sound of keyboards clicking in the background, I felt the first crack in the story I had been telling myself for years, the story of a perfect family, the story I was about to find out had never been true at all. When I left the bank that afternoon, the air felt different, somehow heavier, even though the sky was clear and the sun hung exactly where it always did, just past midday. I sat in my car for a long moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if the answer might appear somewhere between the rows of parked vehicles, but nothing came, only silence and a slow, steady awareness that the life I thought I understood was beginning to unravel piece by piece. I drove home the same route I had taken for years, passing the same grocery store where I carefully counted every dollar before reaching the register, the same pharmacy where I had quietly asked if there were cheaper alternatives to my medication, the same small park where I sometimes sat on a bench just to avoid turning on the heat at home during the colder months. And now every one of those moments felt different, not because they had changed, but because I unlocked the front door of my house and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar stillness that had once felt peaceful but now carried something else underneath it, something I could not quite name. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a while, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. As if time itself was trying to remind me that everything I was realizing had not happened overnight. This had been building quietly, carefully for years. I walked over to the small drawer where I kept my important papers, the ones I believed I had full control over, and began sorting through them again, slower this time, more deliberate. Each envelope, each statement, each receipt suddenly felt like a clue instead of a routine record. I noticed things I had never paid attention to before. Signatures that looked familiar but not quite mine, dates that aligned too perfectly with moments when Lily had offered to help me organize my finances, saying it would be easier for me if everything was simplified. I remembered how grateful I had been at the time, how I had smiled and told her I was lucky to have a daughter-in-law who cared so much, and now that memory sat differently, like a sentence I had not understood when I first heard it. I thought about Ethan too, the way he would sit across from me at dinner asking gentle questions about whether I needed anything while never quite meeting my eyes for too long, as if he was afraid of what he might see reflected back at him. I had interpreted it as concern, as the quiet distance of a busy life, but now it felt like something else, something measured, something intentional. I moved to the living room and looked at the framed photographs on the shelf, one by one, birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, all of them captured moments of laughter and closeness. Lily, always positioned at the center, Ethan beside her, his arm resting comfortably around her shoulders, and me just slightly off to the side, smiling in a way that felt natural at the time but now looked almost rehearsed, as if I had been playing a role I did not realize I had been given. I picked up one of the frames and held it closer, studying my own expression, searching for any sign that I had known something even then, but there was nothing, only trust, only the quiet belief that I was part of something genuine. I set the frame back down carefully and walked toward the window, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor in long golden lines, and for the first time I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided since leaving the bank, not whether something had been hidden from me, but how long it had been happening and why I had never seen it before. I did not feel anger, not yet. What I felt was something far more unsettling, a clarity that was still forming, a realization that the life I had accepted, the sacrifices I had justified, the struggles I had endured might not have been necessary at all, and that thought settled into me slowly like a truth that had been waiting patiently for me to catch up to it. I reached for my phone and looked at Ethan's name on the screen, my thumb hovering just above it for a second before I lowered my hand again, not because I was afraid but because I understood something now that I had not understood before. Answers given too quickly are rarely honest, and whatever this was, it deserved more than a simple question. It deserved patience, observation, and the kind of silence that allows people to reveal themselves without realizing it. And as I stood there in my quiet living room with the fading light and the steady ticking of the clock, I made a decision. I would not confront them, not yet. I would watch, I would listen, and for the first time in a very long time I would stop assuming that the story I had been told was the truth. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, before the sun had fully risen. The house still wrapped in that quiet gray light that makes everything feel suspended between night and day. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a car passing by outside, and I realized that for the first time in years my thoughts were not about what I needed to do that day or how to stretch what little I had, but about something else entirely, something sharper, more focused. I got out of bed, slowly moving through my routine with the same careful motions I always had, but now every action felt deliberate, as if I were paying attention in a way I never had before. I brewed my coffee, measured exactly the same amount as always, and stood by the window watching the steam rise from the cup in my hands, thinking about everything I had seen the day before and how easily it could have been dismissed if I had not looked closely enough. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my notebook, the one I used to keep track of my expenses, and began writing down dates, numbers, small details from memory, moments that had never seemed important until now. I wrote about the time Lily insisted on setting up automatic payments for me, saying it would save me the trouble of remembering. I wrote about the afternoon Ethan had stopped by unexpectedly, asking for my signature on a document he said was routine, something about updating records, and how I had signed it without reading too carefully because I trusted him completely. I wrote about the conversations where they reassured me that everything was under control, that I did not need to worry about financial matters anymore, and as I wrote, the pieces began to align in a way that made my chest feel tight, not with panic, but with understanding. This was not one mistake or one misunderstanding, it was a pattern, something built slowly over time, something that relied on my trust and my willingness to believe that I was being taken care of instead of being managed. I closed the notebook and sat back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me again, and I realized that the most unsettling part was not what they had done but how Naturally, it had fit into the life I thought we had created together. Later that afternoon, Ethan called, his name lighting up my phone just as it always did, and for a moment I simply looked at it, letting it ring once, twice before I answered, my voice steady. When I greeted him, he asked how I was, his tone warm, familiar, and I responded the way I always had, telling him I was fine, that everything was going well, even though I could hear now how practiced those exchanges were, how easy it was for both of us to stay within the lines of a conversation that never reached anything real. He mentioned that he and Lily were planning to come by for dinner that evening and asked if that would be all right. I said yes, of course, because saying no would have raised questions I was not ready to answer yet. After we hung up, I remained seated for a moment longer, then stood and began preparing the house the way I always did, wiping down the counters, setting the table, making sure everything looked just right. But this time I was not doing it out of habit or expectation. I was doing it because I wanted to see them clearly, to watch the way they moved, the way they spoke, the small details that reveal more than words ever do. When they arrived, Lily stepped in first, her smile bright and polished as she greeted me with a light embrace, commenting on how lovely the house looked. Ethan followed close behind, carrying a bottle of wine he set on the counter as if it were part of a ritual we had performed countless times before, and perhaps we sat down to eat and the conversation flowed easily, stories about their work plans for the weekend, casual laughter that would have once reassured me that everything was exactly as it should be. But now I noticed the pauses, the glances, the subtle ways Lily would answer questions directed at Ethan, or how he would defer to her without hesitation. I asked a simple question about their recent trip, something neutral, something ordinary, and watched as they exchanged a quick look before responding, the kind of look that lasts only a second but says more than a full conversation. And in that moment I understood that whatever had been hidden from me was not just about money, it was about control, about decisions made without me, about a version of my life that had been carefully shaped while I stood just outside of it, believing I was still at the center. And as the evening continued, I smiled, I nodded, I listened, and I said nothing, because now that I could see it, I knew one thing for certain: the truth does not reveal itself all at once, it unfolds slowly for those who are patient enough to wait. And I had waited long enough to know that this was only the beginning. After they left that night, the house felt quieter than usual, not empty but stripped of something I had once mistaken for warmth. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing the last plate, listening to the soft echo of water against porcelain and replaying every word, every glance, every pause from dinner in my mind, as if I were studying a language I had only just begun to understand. Lily's laughter had been light, perfectly timed, but it never reached her eyes, and Ethan had followed her lead in a way that felt less like agreement and more like habit, something practiced over time until it became automatic. I dried my hands slowly and turned off the kitchen light, leaving the room in shadow before making my way to the living room, where the photographs still sat in their frames, unchanged but no longer innocent. The first did not pick them up this time. I only looked at them from a distance, as if that would make it easier to see what had always been there. The next day I decided to do something I had not done in years. I drove back to the bank, not to ask questions but to listen more carefully. This time the same young woman greeted me with the same polite smile, but now I noticed the way her tone shifted slightly when she spoke about my account, as if she were choosing her words more deliberately. I asked her to walk me through everything from the beginning, every transaction, every authorization, every name attached to the account, and she hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already suspected before turning the screen toward me again. This time I did not focus on the balance, I focused on the details, dates that matched moments I could now recall, signatures that were mine but placed on documents I had not fully understood, transfers that occurred with a regularity that suggested planning rather than coincidence. And then there were the authorizations. Ethan's name appeared more than once, not as the primary holder but as someone with access, someone who could move money, make decisions, and adjust things without ever needing to involve me directly. Lily's name appeared less frequently, but when it did, it was tied to changes, updates, and approvals, the kind that shaped the structure of an account rather than simply use it. I felt no shock, only a quiet confirmation of what had already begun to take form in my mind. This was not something that had happened to me, it was something that had been arranged around me carefully, quietly, and over a long period of time. I thanked the woman for her help and left the bank without asking anything further, because I understood now that answers given too easily are often incomplete. What I needed was not explanation but clarity, and that required patience. When I returned home, I did not go inside right away. I sat in my car with the engine off, watching the reflection of my house in the windshield, a place that had always felt like mine now appearing slightly distant, as if I were seeing it from the outside. For the first time I thought about all the years I had believed I was being protected, cared for, included in Decisions that mattered, and I realized how easily that belief had allowed everything else to happen without resistance. I finally stepped out of the car and walked inside, setting my keys down in the same place I always had, but nothing felt automatic anymore. Every movement carried intention, every thought carried weight. I went to my desk and opened the notebook again, adding new details to the list: names, dates, patterns, connections, and as I wrote I began to see it more clearly, not just the actions themselves, but the structure behind them, the way control had been established gradually, the way my independence had been reduced in small manageable steps until I no longer questioned it. I paused for a moment, staring at the page before closing the notebook gently and leaning back in my chair. There was no anger, no sense of urgency, only a steady awareness that I had been given something valuable, not the money, not the account, but the truth. And truth, when seen clearly, does not demand reaction, it demands strategy. One reached for my phone again, not to call Ethan, but to look through old messages, emails, small exchanges that once seemed ordinary but now carried new meaning, instructions disguised as suggestions, reassurance that discouraged questions. And I understood then that whatever came next would not be decided in a moment. It would unfold carefully, deliberately, and on my terms. And for the first time in a very long time I felt something shift, not in them but in me, a quiet certainty that I was no longer standing outside my own life watching it happen. I was beginning to take it back piece by piece. That evening I did something I had not done in years. I opened the old metal box I kept in the back of my closet, the one I had not touched since my husband passed away, and inside it were documents I had once believed were complete records of my life insurance papers, property records, old tax returns, things I had trusted without question at the time, but now I handled each piece differently, slower, more carefully, as if I were expecting them to reveal something I had missed before. I spread everything across my bed, organizing them by date, by type, by anything that might help me see a pattern, and it did not take long before the inconsistencies began to surface. There were gaps, years where certain documents should have been but were not, statements that ended abruptly, replaced by newer ones that looked cleaner, more simplified, almost as if someone had decided what I needed to see and what I did not. I sat down on the edge of the bed, holding one of the older folders in my hands, remembering how Ethan had once offered to help me sort through everything after his father died, saying it would be easier for me if he handled the complicated parts, and I had believed him because at that time I was grieving, I was tired, and I wanted to believe that someone else could carry the weight for a while. What I had not realized then was that handing over responsibility also meant handing over control, and control once given away is not always returned easily. I continued going through the documents, noting every missing page, every signature, every date that did not quite align with what I remembered, and then I found something that made me pause: a power of attorney document, partially filled out, not finalized, but bearing my name and Ethan's, along with a section that had been left blank as if it had been prepared but never officially completed, or perhaps completed elsewhere. I could not be sure, but the existence of it alone told me that this had been considered, planned, even if it had not been fully executed in this form. I placed the paper aside and leaned back, taking a slow breath, letting the weight of it settle without allowing it to overwhelm me, because what I was seeing now was not chaos, it was structure, a system built over time with careful steps, each one small enough to go unnoticed on its own, but together forming something far more significant. I closed the box and returned everything to its place, not out of denial, but out of understanding. I did not need to confront them with this, not yet. What I needed was confirmation, something undeniable, something that would not rely on memory or interpretation, but on facts that could not be explained away. The next morning I made a call, not to Ethan, not to Lily, but to an old contact, someone I had not spoken to in years, Mr. Henderson, my late husband's attorney, a man who had always been precise in his work and careful with his words. When he answered, he sounded surprised but warm, and after a few moments of polite conversation, I asked if I could come by to review some documents. I kept my tone light, as if it were a simple matter, something routine, and he agreed without hesitation, offering me a time later that week. When I hung up, I felt a quiet sense of direction settle in, not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity, the kind that comes when uncertainty begins to take shape. I spent the rest of the day as I normally would, making small meals, tidying the house, moving through familiar routines, but everything felt different now. Not because the tasks had changed, but because I was no longer moving through my life on assumption. I was observing, I was noticing the details, the timing, the way certain things aligned too perfectly to be accidental. That evening, Ethan sent a message asking if I needed anything from the store, a simple question, one I had answered countless times before, and I replied just as simply, saying no thank you, I am fine, because I understood now that the surface of things often reveals very little. It is what lies beneath that tells the real story, and I was no longer content with what I could see on the surface. I was preparing quietly, carefully for the moment when everything hidden would finally have nowhere left to stay concealed, and for the first time I did not feel like I was reacting to what had been done to me. I felt like I was stepping into something with intention, something that would unfold exactly as it needed to as long as I remained patient, and that patience was something I had in abundance. The day I met Mr. Henderson, the sky was overcast in a way that made everything feel muted, as if the world itself had lowered its voice. I arrived 10 minutes early out of habit and sat in my car watching people move in and out of the building, each one carrying their own quiet concerns and private histories, and I wondered how many of them believed they fully understood their own lives the way I once had. When I finally stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and paper greeted me the same as it had years ago. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. He welcomed me with a firm handshake, his expression kind but observant, the way it had always been, and after a few brief pleasantries we sat down across from each other at his desk. I did not rush into explanations. I simply placed the documents I had brought with me neatly in front of him and asked if he would help me review them. His eyes moved carefully over each page, his brow tightening slightly at certain points, though he said nothing at first, and I let the silence remain because I had learned that silence often reveals more than questions ever could. After several minutes he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a seriousness that removed any remaining doubt from the room. "Margaret," he said slowly, "when was the last time you personally reviewed all of your financial and legal documents without assistance?" I paused before answering, not because I did not know, but because saying it out loud made it real. "It has been a long time," I said finally. He nodded once, as if that confirmed something he had already suspected, and then he began to explain, not in a way that alarmed me, but in a way that clarified everything. The accounts, the transfers, the authorizations, they were all structured in a manner that suggested oversight from someone with access and intent, not necessarily illegal on the surface, but certainly not transparent either. He pointed to specific entries showing how funds had been redirected, how permissions had been adjusted over time, how control had gradually shifted without any single action appearing significant enough to raise concern on its own. And as he spoke I felt a quiet steadiness settle within me, because what he was describing was exactly what I had begun to see for myself. This was not an accident, it was a process, one that relied on trust and familiarity to remain unnoticed. He asked me directly if I had knowingly granted access to Ethan in the way the documents suggested, and I answered honestly, I trusted him to help me. I did not understand the extent of what I was signing. He nodded again, his expression neither judgmental nor surprised, and then he said something that stayed with me longer than anything else. "Trust is not a weakness, Margaret, but it becomes a vulnerability when it is not matched with accountability." I let that sit between us for a moment before asking the question I had been holding since the beginning. "What can be done?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he gathered the papers into a neat stack, aligning them carefully as if the act itself required precision. Before speaking, "What can be done depends on what you want, Margaret. Do you want to confront them now, or do you want to understand everything fully before you act?" The distinction mattered more than I expected, because it was not simply about action. It was about timing, about control, about choosing the moment rather than reacting to it. I looked down at the documents, then back at him, and answered without hesitation, "I want to understand everything first." He gave a small approving nod and began outlining the steps we could take, reviewing full account histories, verifying authorizations, documenting inconsistencies, all done quietly, without drawing attention, without giving anyone reason to adjust their behavior before I was ready to see it clearly. I listened carefully, committing each detail to memory, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was focused in a way I had not been in years. When our meeting ended, I gathered the papers and stood thanking him for his time, and as I walked out of the office I felt something I had not felt since before all of this began. Not relief, not anger, but certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that simply exists beneath the surface, guiding each step forward. I returned to my car and sat for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation but out of awareness, because I understood now that whatever came next would not be rushed, it would not be emotional, it would be deliberate. And as I started the engine and pulled away, I realized that for the first time in a very long time I was no longer reacting to the life around me. I was shaping what would happen next. Over the next few days I moved through my routine with a quiet precision that would have looked ordinary to anyone watching, but nothing I did was automatic anymore. Every action had a purpose, every interaction became an opportunity to observe rather than participate. I followed the steps Mr. Henderson had outlined carefully requesting full account histories through official channels, reviewing documents line by line, comparing them against my own records, and what I discovered did not come all at once. It unfolded gradually like a picture coming into focus, one layer at a time. There were transactions that aligned too neatly with moments I now remembered clearly, times when Ethan had visited offering to handle something small, or when Lily had suggested an update that seemed harmless at the time. The pattern was consistent: funds moved, permissions adjusted, oversight shifted, all under the appearance of efficiency and care. I did not confront them. I did not even hint at what I knew. Instead, I invited them over again for dinner just as I had before, because familiarity creates comfort and comfort lowers defenses. When they arrived, everything was as it always had been. Lily's smile perfectly measured, Ethan's tone relaxed and attentive, the three of us sitting at the table sharing a meal that would have once reassured me that everything was stable. But now I listened differently. I asked simple questions, nothing direct, nothing that would alert them, but enough to watch how they responded, how quickly Lily answered on Ethan's behalf, how often he deferred to her without even realizing it. I mentioned the bank casually, not as an accusation but as a passing detail, saying I had stopped by to ask about a minor issue with a statement, and I watched carefully as Lily's hand paused for just a fraction of a second before she picked up her glass again. It was subtle, so subtle it would have been easy to miss, but I did not miss it, not anymore. Ethan asked what the issue was, his voice steady, but there was something beneath it, something measured. I smiled and said it was nothing, just a misunderstanding that had already been resolved, and I let the conversation move on because I understood now that the truth reveals itself more clearly when people believe there is nothing to hide. As the evening continued, I noticed more the way Lily redirected topics whenever finances came up, the way Ethan avoided details by offering broad, reassuring statements instead of specifics. It was not what they said that mattered, it was what they did not say, the spaces between their words that carried the real meaning. After they left, I returned to my desk and added more notes to my notebook, not emotional reactions, not assumptions, just facts, dates, observations, connections. I was building something now, not just understanding but proof, something that could not be dismissed or explained away later. And with each entry I felt the structure become clearer, stronger, more complete, a system designed to manage my assets without my full awareness, to benefit from my trust without ever fully revealing the extent of what was being done. The following afternoon, I received a call from the bank confirming that additional records were ready for review, and when I went back, everything aligned even more precisely than before. Transfers that had once seemed isolated now formed a consistent pattern. Permissions that had appeared routine now showed a deliberate progression of control, and as I sat there reviewing the documents, I realized something important. This was not about taking everything from me, it was about controlling just enough to benefit without triggering suspicion, a balance carefully maintained over time. And that realization changed something inside me, because it meant they had not expected me to see this. They had relied on my consistency, my trust, my willingness to believe that everything was as it appeared, and that reliance had become their weakness, not mine. When I returned home that evening, I did not feel anger, I did not feel urgency, I felt clarity, the kind that settles deeply and does not waver. I stood in the quiet of my living room looking at the same photographs, the same furniture, the same life I had always known, and for the first time I saw it for what it truly was. Not perfect, not broken, but constructed. And once something is seen as it truly is, it cannot be unseen, and that knowledge is not something that demands immediate action, it is something that waits patiently for the right moment to be used. And I knew that moment was coming, not because I would force it, but because I would allow everything to unfold exactly as it had been designed to, until there was no room left for anything but the truth. By the time the final set of documents arrived, I no longer felt like I was searching for answers, I felt like I was confirming something I already understood. The pattern was complete now, every transaction, every authorization, every quiet adjustment mapped out with a precision that left no room for doubt. I spread the documents across my dining table, the same table where we had shared countless meals, the same place where laughter had once filled the room, and now it had become something else entirely, a place where truth was laid out in clear, undeniable lines. I did not rush through it. I read each page slowly, carefully, as if the act of reading itself required respect, not for what had been done, but for the clarity it now provided. There were dates that matched conversations I could now recall with perfect accuracy, moments when Lily had gently insisted on simplifying things, moments when Ethan had reassured me that everything was handled and I did not need to worry, and now I could see exactly what those moments had been covering. Not one large decision, not one obvious act, but a series of small calculated steps, each one designed to appear reasonable, each one building on the last until control had shifted so gradually that I had never felt it happen. I gathered the papers into a single folder and placed it neatly on the table. Then I sat down across from it, folding my hands in front of me, not out of hesitation but out of stillness, because I understood now that this was the moment where everything changed, not for them but for me. I reached for my phone and called Ethan, my voice calm when he answered. I told him I would like them both to come by the next evening. There was something important I wanted to discuss. I did not give details I did not need to. He agreed without hesitation, his tone light as if this were no different from any other invitation, and when I ended the call I felt a quiet certainty settle in, not anticipation, not anxiety, just readiness. The next day passed in a way that felt almost ordinary. I prepared the house as I always did, setting the table, making sure everything was in place, but this time each action felt intentional, each movement part of something larger, not a routine but a decision. I chose the same dishes, the same arrangement, the same details that had always been there because familiarity would matter. They would walk into something they recognized, something they believed they understood, and that belief would allow everything else to unfold without resistance. When evening came and I heard the sound of their car pulling into the driveway, I stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than necessary, letting the stillness settle around me before walking to the door and opening it. Lily greeted me first, her smile warm and practiced, Ethan just behind her carrying that same easy expression I had seen so many times before. We moved through the motions of greeting, sitting down, beginning the meal, and for a while everything appeared exactly as it always had been. Conversation, light topics, familiar laughter, but beneath it all there was something else now, something they could not see but I could feel clearly. The shift in control, the quiet understanding that I was no longer part of the performance. I was observing it. I let them speak, I let the conversation move naturally, and then at the right moment I reached for the folder beside me and placed it gently on the table between us. I did not open it, I did not explain it immediately. I simply let it sit there, allowing its presence to interrupt the rhythm of the evening, just enough for them to notice. Lily's eyes moved to it first, a brief glance, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. Ethan followed a moment later, his expression unchanged but his posture slightly more rigid, and I understood then that this was the moment, not because I had forced it but because everything had led here naturally. I looked at them both calmly and said, there is something I would like us to go through together. And my voice did not waver because it did not need to. Everything that needed to be known was already there, waiting to be seen, and for the first time since all of this began I was not waiting for answers, I was ready to reveal them. For a moment neither of them spoke, the folder resting between us like something neither of them had expected to see in this room in this moment, and I could feel the shift immediately, not loud, not dramatic, but subtle, the way tension settles into a space when something unspoken finally begins to surface. Lily was the first to move, her smile still in place but no longer as effortless as before, as she reached for her glass, taking a small sip as if giving herself time. Ethan glanced at me, then at the folder and back again, his expression carefully neutral, but I had spent a lifetime reading him and I could see it now, the calculation, the quiet attempt to understand how much I knew without asking directly. I placed my hand gently on the folder and opened it slowly, not with urgency but with intention, turning the first page toward them so they could see it clearly. I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I simply began to speak in the same calm tone I had used all evening. I asked simple questions, ones that did not allow for vague answers, dates, amounts, signatures, each one placed in front of them exactly as it appeared on the page, and at first they responded the way I expected, carefully choosing their words, offering explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. But as I continued turning pages, as I continued laying out the pattern piece by piece, those explanations began to lose their structure. Lily spoke more quickly now, her voice still controlled but with a slight edge that had not been there before. She described it as helping, as organizing, as making things easier for me, and I listened without interruption because I understood that people reveal more when they believe they are still in control. Ethan said less, he watched more, his eyes moving between me and the documents as if trying to find a version of this situation where it could still be explained away, but there was none, not anymore. When I reached the final page I stopped, not because I had run out of evidence but because I had reached the point where no more was needed. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on the table, looking at both of them without anger, without accusation, only clarity, and I said something I had not said in a very long time. I understand exactly what has been happening here, and for the first time since the conversation began neither of them had an immediate response. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer comfortable, it was no longer controlled, it was honest in a way that nothing else had been. Lily's composure shifted just slightly, her shoulders tightening as she began to explain again, but this time The words felt different, less certain, more defensive. Ethan finally spoke, then his voice lower than before, asking why I had not said anything sooner, and I looked at him for a moment before answering because I needed to see everything clearly before I decided what to do with it. That answer settled between us in a way that changed the entire conversation, because it was no longer about what they had done, it was about what I would do next. I did not argue, I did not raise my voice, I simply outlined the steps I had already taken, the records that had been reviewed, the documentation that existed, the fact that everything was now understood and accounted for, and I made it clear in the same steady tone that I would be reclaiming full control over all accounts and decisions moving forward, not as a reaction, not as a punishment, but as a correction of something that should never have been altered in the first place. Lily tried to speak again, but I did not need to hear it, not because her words did not matter, but because they no longer changed anything. Ethan sat quietly, his expression no longer guarded but uncertain, as if he were seeing something he had not expected to face, and in that moment I realized something important. This was not the end of something, it was the beginning of something else, something more honest, more defined, more real than anything we had shared before. I stood from the table, gathering the folder in my hands, and as I did I felt no anger, no bitterness, only a quiet sense of completion, because the truth once revealed does not need to be forced, it simply stands on its own. I looked at them one last time, not as the family I had believed them to be, but as they truly were, and I understood that what I had lost was not real to begin with, and what I had gained was something far more valuable: clarity, control, and the certainty that I was no longer living inside a story that had been written for me. I was finally writing my own